Have you ever noticed how some celebrities seem to wear their fame like armor, while others carry it with a quiet grace that makes you wonder what's behind their eyes? That's the thought that crossed my mind as I watched Keanu Reeves take his seat across from Oprah Winfrey, the studio lights catching the silver in his beard, his eyes carrying that familiar mixture of warmth and melancholy we've come to recognize over decades of watching him on screen. Where are you watching from today? Comment down below. It was supposed to be just another celebrity interview, promoting a film, sharing a few rehearsed anecdotes, maybe a carefully curated personal story. But something different happened that day. Something that reminded us why, in an industry built on facades, Keanu Reeves has always felt somehow real. The conversation had been flowing easily for about 15 minutes. Oprah masterfully guiding Keanu through discussions of his latest projects, his motorcycle collection, his unexpected renaissance as an action star well into his 50s. The audience was engaged, laughing at his self-deprecating humor, nodding along to his thoughtful responses. But then came the pivot. That moment when Oprah does what she does best, asks the question that peels back the veneer. "Keanu," she said, leaning forward slightly, her voice dropping to that intimate register her longtime viewers recognize as the prelude to something meaningful. "You've experienced tremendous loss in your life. You've known profound grief. Yet people who work with you consistently describe you as one of the most generous, kind, and grounded people they've ever met. What anchors you?" There was a pause, not the uncomfortable silence of someone caught off guard, but the deliberate quiet of a man who doesn't rush to fill empty space with empty words. The studio audience, normally rustling with movement, fell completely still. And in that suspended moment, something shifted in Keanu's expression, a subtle change, like clouds parting just enough to let a single beam of light through. What happened next wasn't scripted. It wasn't calculated for viral potential or carefully constructed to enhance a public image. It was simply a man who happens to be famous, opening a door to let us glimpse something deeply personal, his relationship with faith, with suffering, with the search for meaning in a world that often seems chaotic and cruel. The journey that brought Keanu Reeves to that moment on Oprah's stage began long before he became a household name. Born in Beirut and raised primarily in Toronto, his early life was marked by movement and change. His father left when he was just 3 years old. He attended 4 different high schools, struggling with dyslexia that made traditional education challenging. Yet even then, those who knew him described an unusual quality about him, a thoughtfulness, a gentleness that seemed at odds with the typical teenage experience. His rise to fame came with its own complications. Success in Hollywood arrived relatively quickly, from supporting roles to leading man status in films that would define generations of moviegoers. But as his star ascended, life dealt Keanu a series of devastating blows that would have broken many people. In 1999, his daughter with girlfriend Jennifer Syme was stillborn at 8 months. The grief of this loss ended their relationship, though they remained friends. Then, just 18 months later, Jennifer died in a car accident. This came after Keanu had already lost his closest friend, River Phoenix, to a drug overdose in 1993. It's the kind of suffering that raises the oldest questions humans have asked. Why do bad things happen to good people? Is there meaning in suffering? Is there something, anything, beyond the physical world and its seemingly random cruelties? These are questions that Keanu has grappled with, largely away from the public eye. Unlike many celebrities who broadcast their spiritual journeys or religious conversions, he has kept his innermost thoughts on faith and meaning largely private, until that day with Oprah. As the camera held steady on his face, you could see him making a decision, weighing how much to share, how vulnerable to be. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but clear, carrying to every corner of the studio. "I think about the people I've lost every day," he began. "Not always with sadness anymore, though that's still there. Sometimes it's with gratitude that they were in my life at all. Sometimes it's with this sense that they're still around, not in a way I can touch or see, but in a way I can feel." Oprah nodded, giving him space to continue. And continue he did, moving into territory he rarely explores publicly. "I was raised with some Catholic influence, some Buddhist influence, My mom was interested in a lot of different spiritual traditions. For a long time, especially after the losses, I couldn't reconcile any kind of loving presence in the universe with what had happened. It felt random and cruel and pointless. His hands, usually so still, moved slightly as he searched for the right words. But over time, I started to feel something else. Not answers, I don't have answers, but a sense that there's a pattern, even when I can't see it. A connectedness between all things, between all people, between life and death. The audience was completely silent now, many visibly moved. Oprah, who has interviewed thousands of people over her career, seemed to recognize the rare authenticity of the moment, asking softly, "Would you call that faith?" Keanu considered this carefully. "I think I would, not faith in the sense of certainty, not faith as a set of rigid beliefs, but faith as openness, faith as the willingness to be surprised by goodness, faith as the choice to see meaning and beauty, even in the midst of loss." It wasn't a declaration of religious conversion. It wasn't a testimony or a preaching moment. It was something more universal, a window into how one human being has found his way through unimaginable pain, toward a place of peace that doesn't deny the reality of suffering, but somehow encompasses it within something larger. As the segment came to an end and the show cut to commercial, social media was already beginning to light up. In a culture often divided by religious differences, Keanu's words seemed to transcend the usual boundaries. People of different faiths, and no faith at all, found something recognizable in his journey, the universal human experience of seeking meaning in the face of loss. What makes this moment so powerful isn't that Keanu Reeves has found all the answers. It's that he continues to ask the questions, to remain open to wonder and possibility, even after experiences that could have closed him off forever. In an age of polarization and certainty, his humility and openness feel like a different kind of strength, one that acknowledges vulnerability rather than disguising it. Perhaps that's why, long after the interview aired, people continue to share clips of that moment online. In Keanu's gentle reflection on faith, many find permission to embrace their own complex spiritual journeys, to acknowledge doubt alongside belief, to honor questions as much as answers, to recognize that spirituality at its most authentic is rarely about absolute certainty, but about continuing to seek and remain open to the mystery that surrounds us all. And maybe that's the most warming thing about Keanu Reeves's heart. Not that it hasn't been broken, but that it has broken open rather than closed. In his quiet way, without preaching or posturing, he reminds us that faith, in its deepest sense, might be less about having all the answers and more about learning to live meaningfully with the questions. The Oprah Winfrey Show had always been more than just a talk show. For decades, it served as America's living room, a place where celebrities and ordinary people alike revealed parts of themselves they'd never shared before. The studio itself was designed to create that sense of intimacy, with its warm lighting and comfortable seating arranged to feel more like a conversation between friends than a televised interview. On this particular day, that atmosphere would prove more important than ever. Keanu had arrived at the studio earlier than scheduled, something the production assistants noted was typical of him. No entourage, no special requests. Just a man in simple black clothing, carrying a motorcycle helmet, thanking each staff member by name after they'd been introduced. For someone who had been famous for over 3 decades, his lack of pretension was still striking. He asked about the crew's day before talking about himself. One production assistant would later share on social media. When the catering staff brought him water, he stood up to thank them. These small moments weren't performative. No cameras were rolling yet. They were simply glimpses of the person Keanu had chosen to be, famous or not. When Oprah entered the green room to greet him before the show, their exchange was warm but brief. Those present noted that she seemed to instinctively understand his preference for quiet before going on stage. Sometimes the biggest personalities need the most stillness to prepare, she would later write in her journal about the interview. With Keanu, I sensed a depth that required space. The audience that day was typical of Oprah's shows, predominantly women spanning different ages, backgrounds, and life experiences. Many had grown up watching Keanu on screen, from his early days in films like Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure to the philosophical action of The Matrix and the raw emotion of John Wick. They had watched him age from a young heartthrob to a man whose face now carried the lines of experience. In a way, they had grown older alongside him. What they didn't know was how much this particular episode would resonate with them, not because of Hollywood gossip or movie promotions, but because of its profound humanity. As the lights dimmed slightly and the cameras began rolling, there was a subtle shift in the room's energy. Oprah, always masterful at creating moments that transcend typical celebrity interviews, began not with questions about Keanu's latest project, but with observations about his reputation in Hollywood. "I've been doing this a long time," she said, her voice carrying that perfect blend of conversational ease and purposeful direction. "And I've interviewed thousands of celebrities, but I've never heard the kind of consistent stories about anyone that I hear about you." Keanu's expression registered slight discomfort, not from offense, but from the natural modesty that has become his trademark. People who work with you, from directors to the catering staff on set, they all say the same thing, that you show a kindness and consideration that's rare in any industry, but especially in entertainment. Where does that come from? The question was an invitation to something deeper than the usual promotional conversation. It was Oprah doing what she does best, using her platform to explore the human condition through the individuals sitting across from her. For a moment, Keanu looked down at his hands, collecting his thoughts. The audience waited. Oprah, never rushing to fill silence, waited too. When he looked up, his response was thoughtful, but initially deflective. "I've just been fortunate to work with really wonderful people," he said, redistributing the praise in that characteristic way. But Oprah, sensing there was more, gently pressed. "Yes, but that's not what I'm asking," she said with a smile that communicated both warmth and persistence. "There are stories about you giving away millions of your earnings from The Matrix to the special effects team. About you stopping to help strangers with car trouble. About you taking pay cuts so other actors could be hired. These aren't typical Hollywood stories." The audience murmured in agreement, and someone called out, "We love you, Keanu," generating soft laughter and breaking some of the tension. Keanu smiled, that genuine, slightly lopsided smile that has endeared him to fans for years. "I've been very lucky in my life," he began again, his voice carrying that distinctive cadence, thoughtful, measured, with slight pauses that suggest he's carefully considering each word. "And I've also experienced significant loss. I think maybe those two things together, incredible good fortune alongside profound grief, they change your perspective." The studio grew quieter, the audience leaning in slightly. When you've been given so much and you've also lost so much, you develop this acute awareness that we're all just trying to make it through, you know? We're all carrying something heavy, and the least we can do is try not to add to each other's burdens. It was this segue that would lead to the deeper conversation about faith that would soon capture the attention of millions. But before that spiritual revelation, Keanu shared something equally profound, his philosophy of human interaction, formed in the crucible of extraordinary success and devastating personal tragedy. "My mom raised me to believe that how you treat people matters more than what you achieve," he continued. "And over the years, I've come to believe that even more strongly, because achievements fade, awards gather dust. But how we make other people feel, that remains. That ripples outward in ways we might never see." The simplicity of this statement, delivered without pretense, resonated visibly with the audience. In an age of carefully curated social media personas and celebrity brands built on controversy, Keanu's straightforward humanity felt like a breath of fresh air. Oprah nodded, recognizing the truth in his words. "That's a kind of faith in itself, isn't it? Faith in the importance of human connection. Faith that kindness matters." And it was this gentle observation that would open the door to the most revealing portion of their conversation, the discussion of spirituality that would soon move so many viewers to tears and reflection. Faith that kindness matters. Oprah's words hung in the air, creating a bridge between Keanu's philosophy of human interaction and something deeper, something that many celebrities are reluctant to discuss on camera: spiritual belief. For a moment, Keanu's expression shifted, becoming more contemplative. The audience, sensing they were witnessing something rare, grew even quieter. When Keanu began speaking again, his voice had taken on a quality that suggested he was sharing thoughts he usually kept private. "You know, I wasn't raised with a strong religious tradition," he said. "My mother was interested in many different spiritual paths. She exposed me to various philosophies and beliefs, which I appreciate now. It gave me the freedom to explore and question." Oprah nodded encouragingly. "And what did that exploration lead you to?" This was the question that would take their conversation to an unexpected depth. Keanu took a breath, as if preparing to dive underwater. "For a long time, especially after losing people I loved, I struggled with the idea of any kind of benevolent order to the universe. It's hard to reconcile personal tragedy with the idea of a loving presence watching over us." The raw honesty of this admission seemed to touch something in the audience. Several people nodded in recognition of this universal human struggle, the question of how to maintain faith in the face of suffering. "But over the years," Keanu continued, "I've come to see faith not as certainty about what happens after we die, or even certainty about why things happen the way they do. I've come to see it as something much more immediate, much more present." He shifted slightly in his chair, searching for the right words. "There's a quote I read years ago, I believe it was from Dostoevsky, about how we're all responsible for everyone else's happiness. That idea has stayed with me, the notion that we're all connected, that what happens to you in some way happens to me too. That's become a kind of faith for me." Oprah, visibly moved by his sincerity, asked, "So your faith is more about connection than about doctrine?" "Yes," Keanu nodded, seeming relieved at her understanding. "It's about recognizing that behind all our differences, our beliefs, our backgrounds, our circumstances, there's something shared, something sacred." He paused, perhaps aware that he was using language he didn't often employ in public. "I don't know if that makes sense, but it's what I've come to feel. That whatever divine presence might exist, it exists in the space between us, in how we choose to treat each other." The camera panned briefly to the audience, capturing faces rapt with attention, some with tears welling in their eyes. It was clear that Keanu's words were resonating deeply, cutting through the typical celebrity interview to touch something universal. "There's a Buddhist concept," he continued, warming to the subject now that he'd crossed the threshold into openly discussing spirituality, called dependent origination. It's the idea that nothing exists in isolation, that everything arises in dependence upon multiple causes and conditions. I find beauty in that perspective. It helps me make sense of both the joy and the suffering in life. Oprah, ever the skilled interviewer, recognized the significance of what was happening. "Many people watching know about the losses you've endured, your daughter, your former partner Jennifer, your friend River Phoenix. Has your understanding of faith helped you navigate that grief?" The question was direct, but asked with such compassion that it created a safe space for an authentic response. Keanu was quiet for a moment, his eyes reflecting a depth of feeling that words alone couldn't capture. Grief is love with nowhere to go," he finally said, the phrase striking in its poetic truth. "I think faith gives that love somewhere to go, not in a way that diminishes the loss or pretends it isn't painful, but in a way that honors the connection that remains." He looked directly at Oprah now, seemingly speaking not just to her, but to anyone who had experienced profound loss. "I don't believe those connections end completely with death. They change form, and learning to feel those connections differently, that's been part of my journey." The studio was completely silent now, every person present understanding they were witnessing something extraordinary, not because Keanu was declaring allegiance to any particular religious doctrine, but because he was articulating a deeply personal, spiritual understanding that transcended doctrinal boundaries. "There was a period after Jennifer died," he continued, his voice steady but emotional, "when I would feel her presence so strongly in certain moments, not in a supernatural way, but in the way that love persists, in memories that feel so vivid they're almost tangible, in dreams that feel like visits." He smiled softly. "Is that faith? I don't know, but it's something I've come to trust. This sense that love doesn't simply disappear, that it remains as part of the fabric of who we are, who we become after loss. Oprah, who had interviewed countless people about spirituality over her career, seemed particularly touched by the authenticity of Keanu's perspective. What you're describing sounds like a very lived faith, not something intellectual or abstract, but something experienced. Yes, Keanu agreed, appearing somewhat relieved at her understanding. It's not about having the answers. It's about living with the questions in a way that allows for meaning, allows for connection, allows for hope. He leaned forward slightly, the intensity of his gaze conveying the importance of what he was about to say. I don't know what happens when we die. I won't pretend to have that certainty, but I believe in the significance of how we live, in the power of small kindnesses, in the way that compassion can transform suffering, not by eliminating it, but by giving it purpose. As he spoke these words, the camera captured a subtle change in the audience, a collective recognition that they were hearing not just the philosophical musings of a Hollywood actor, but the hard-won wisdom of a fellow human being who had walked through fire and emerged with something valuable to share. That's beautifully expressed, Oprah said softly, and I think it speaks to why people respond to you the way they do, both on screen and off. There's an authenticity there, a presence that feels genuine. Keanu looked down, characteristically humble in the face of praise, but when he looked up again, there was a quiet certainty in his expression that suggested he had more to share, perspectives on faith and meaning that would further warm the hearts of those watching and listening. As their conversation deepened, Oprah shifted slightly in her chair, a signal to those familiar with her interviewing style that she was about to take the discussion even further. Keanu, you've spoken about faith as connection, as presence, as a way of being in relationship with others. I'm curious, how does this perspective shape your daily life, your work, your interactions with strangers? Keanu considered the question, his gaze thoughtful. There was something powerful about witnessing a man typically so private, allowing himself to be this vulnerable, this open about matters of the heart and spirit. It changes everything, he said simply. When you believe that what matters most is how we treat each other, not just the big dramatic moments, but the small, everyday interactions, it becomes a kind of practice, a discipline, really. He smiled slightly, as if acknowledging the challenge of this approach. I fail at it constantly, but that's part of faith too, isn't it? The willingness to begin again, to try again, to be present, to be kind, to recognize the humanity in the person in front of you. Oprah nodded in recognition. That's a profound way to move through the world, and yet, you work in an industry that often values very different things: image, status, competition. Has it been difficult to maintain this perspective in Hollywood? The question prompted a genuine laugh from Keanu, warm, slightly self-deprecating. Oh, absolutely. Hollywood can be, well, you know. He gestured vaguely, causing ripples of knowing laughter among the audience. But I've been fortunate to work with many people who share similar values, and I've learned that you can choose your environment to some extent, choose projects that align with what matters to you, choose to work with people who treat others with respect. He paused, then added with characteristic honesty, though I should say, I don't think this struggle is unique to Hollywood. Every industry, every community has its challenges. We're all trying to figure out how to live with integrity in complex systems that don't always reward that. This observation seemed to resonate deeply with the audience, many nodding in recognition of their own similar struggles in different contexts. One thing I've noticed, Oprah said, is that you seem very comfortable with silence, with pausing before you speak, with taking time to consider your words. Is that connected to your spiritual practice in some way? It was an insightful observation that few interviewers would have made, but it clearly struck a chord with Keanu. Yes, I think it is, he acknowledged. There's a quality of attention that feels sacred to me, listening fully, being present, not rushing to fill space with words that don't mean anything. He smiled slightly, though sometimes I'm just trying to find the right word, and people think I'm being profound when I'm just forgetful. The audience laughed warmly at this moment of self-deprecation, but Oprah didn't let the deeper point dissolve into humor. That quality of attention, of truly seeing people, it's something others consistently mention about you. The guy who delivers coffee to your film sets, the lighting technicians, the fans who meet you briefly at events. They all say you have this ability to make them feel truly seen in that moment. Keanu looked genuinely moved by this observation. "That means a lot to me," he said quietly, "because I think that's what we all want, isn't it? To be seen, to be recognized as valuable, as worthy of attention and care. And it costs us nothing to offer that to each other." He shifted forward slightly, his expression earnest. "I had an experience years ago that I think about often. I was at a convenience store very early one morning. The clerk behind the counter looked exhausted, beaten down. When I paid for my items, I just asked how his night was going. It was a small thing, took maybe 10 extra seconds. But his entire demeanor changed. He told me he'd been working double shifts, that his kid was sick, that no one had actually asked him how he was doing in days." Keanu's eyes reflected the significance of this memory. That has stayed with me, how little it takes sometimes to acknowledge another person's humanity, and how rarely some people experience that basic recognition. That's become a kind of spiritual practice for me, trying to really see people, especially those who often go unseen. There was a murmur of appreciation from the audience, many visibly moved by the simplicity and depth of this perspective. "That's beautiful," Oprah said softly, "and it reminds me of something you said earlier about faith as responsibility toward others. Can you speak more about that?" Keanu nodded, clearly comfortable now in this territory that bridged the personal and the philosophical. "There's a concept in many spiritual traditions about our interconnectedness, that we're not separate from each other or from the world around us. When you really absorb that idea, it changes how you see your role in other people's lives." He gestured subtly with his hands as he spoke, a rare animation that suggested the importance of what he was sharing. "If my well-being is connected to yours, and yours to everyone else's, then my actions matter in ways I might not even see. The way I treat the barista making my coffee, the tone I use with someone who makes a mistake, whether I choose patience or frustration in traffic, all of it ripples outward." The camera panned briefly to show audience members listening intently, many nodding in recognition. "That's become a touchstone for me," Keanu continued, "especially on difficult days. This sense that even small choices matter, that kindness is never wasted, that we're participating in something larger than ourselves, whether we recognize it or not." As their conversation neared its conclusion, Oprah asked the question that would elicit Keanu's most moving response, the one that would later be shared millions of times online, transcribed onto images, quoted in articles about spirituality and resilience. "After everything you've experienced, the losses, the challenges, but also the extraordinary success, and the opportunity to touch so many lives through your work, what do you believe about why we're here? What do you believe is the purpose of this human journey?" Keanu was quiet for a long moment, and the studio audience seemed to collectively hold its breath. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of someone who had thought deeply about this question, not as an intellectual exercise, but as a vital necessity for navigating his own life. "I believe we're here to learn how to love better," he said simply, "to learn how to love through joy and through suffering, to learn how to love when it's easy and when it's nearly impossible, to learn how to love not just those who love us back, but those who challenge us, those who are different from us, even those who might wish us harm." His voice grew quieter, but more intense. "I believe we're here to discover that love isn't just an emotion, but a way of being in the world, a way that encompasses justice and mercy, boundaries and openness, speaking truth and listening deeply." As he finished speaking, there was a quality of silence in the studio that few television programs ever achieve. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of collective recognition, of hearts moved by authentic truth. The impact of Keanu's words was visible on Oprah's face as she reached over to briefly touch his hand in a gesture of gratitude. "Thank you for sharing that with us," she said, "for being willing to speak so openly about these deep questions that we all carry." As the segment drew to a close, with the studio lights beginning to brighten and the music cue signaling the approaching commercial break, Keanu offered one final thought, the words that would perhaps most perfectly capture why this interview would resonate with so many for years to come. "The older I get," he said with that gentle half-smile that has endeared him to millions, "the more I believe that our capacity for wonder is perhaps our greatest gift. Wonder at the mystery of being alive at all. Wonder at the resilience of the human spirit. Wonder at how, even in our darkest moments, connection and meaning find a way to reach us." He shrugged slightly, characteristically humble. "I don't have the answers, but I've found that living with the questions, approaching them with openness rather than fear, that itself is a kind of faith that sustains me." As Oprah thanked him and the cameras began to pull back, the audience rose in a spontaneous standing ovation, not merely for a beloved actor, but for a fellow human being who had chosen to share his hard-won wisdom with such genuine humility and grace.